In this demonstration, as we continue our discovery of the basic Photoshop tools, I'm going to talk about three tools that are grouped together here for you in the toolbar, and those would be the Dodge, Burn, and Sponge tools that are located here. The Dodge tool is used to lighten an area by adding a certain percentage of white to an area of an image. The Burn tool is used to darken an area of an image. Sometimes it's easy to get these two confused, and the best way I can give you a little hint or a way to remember what the Burn tool does is think of if you had a piece of paper and you lit a match and you burned the edges of the paper, it darkens the edges of the paper. So that's a good way to differentiate between the two. And then the Sponge tool is used to saturate or desaturate colors within an area of an image. So let's get started and take a look at how these tools work in this basic introduction. So if I had an image in which I felt that an area of the image was too dark, for example, if I wanted to increase the contrast between the rider and the sky, I would want to use the Dodge tool. What I would probably do is attempt to select the sky as best as I can and then utilize the Dodge tool to lighten the sky. Now, the reason that I would like to do this is the eye is drawn to the darkest section of a photograph. And if I felt that the sky was too saturated or competing for attention with our obvious subject here, the rider, then I would want to dodge the sky or lighten it a bit. So the first thing that I would do is probably use a quick selection tool to select the sky. And I would go through and select the sky as best I can. And as you can see, I have probably selected a little too much. But once I have this selection of the sky and not the rider, which I won't make you sit through, what I would use is the Dodge tool. And I'm just going to show you how that Dodge tool works. So within my selection, I choose to use a large size brush. Within your tool options panel, you have the ability to change the size of the brush as well as the relative hardness of the brush. A good place to start is with the midtones range. I start with an exposure of 60 to 70%, somewhere in there, and I start with a large brush because the area that I want to lighten is rather large. So when I get those options selected, then I can go through and lighten the sky. And since these demonstrations are somewhat like a cooking show, I will show you the result of the efforts in a layer in which it's already been completed. Now you can see that I've heightened the contrast between sky and rider, and I've even brought out some of those nice fog, fluffy clouds, and you may or may not be able to see that differentiation in this demonstration depending on your screen resolution, but I feel that the before and after, it's a much better presentation. So that's what the Dodge tool does. Now the Sponge tool is kind of interesting. Located here under the Dodge tool, the Sponge tool will saturate or desaturate areas of an image. In this image, as an example, I feel that perhaps the blue in the concrete is a little too saturated. Maybe there's a little too much blue in that concrete. So I'm going to use the Sponge tool to desaturate the colors. And to do that, I'm going to choose kind of a mid-size brush, maybe a little bit smaller brush, and about 50% hardness, and I'm going to change the mode to desaturate because I'd like to remove some of that bright blue out of the concrete. Now the flow, I might change the flow maybe to start midway and see how we do with that, and maybe even give it a test and see how we're doing. And that seems to be toning down the blue brilliantly. It's just toning down the blue enough so that it reads more as concrete and that it doesn't compete with our subject in the front. And so the desaturation option of the sponge tool brings down highly saturated colors within an area of the photo. And the result is much better contrast between the background and subject than what we began. In some cases, you might have a photograph where you really want to bring out the color in an area of the photograph. In this case, the little girl's red dress has potential to have more contrast between herself and the door if we could just bump up the reds in her dress and purse. So to do that, I'm going to use the sponge tool. I'm going to choose a little bit smaller brush because, as you can see, this is kind of overwhelming our subject. So I'll choose a little bit smaller brush, keep it at about 50% hardness. I'm going to choose saturate mode for the sponge, and then go through and begin bringing up or bumping up the reds in her dress. And the result of these efforts is a more saturated red overall. And now we have better contrast between the girl and the background, which is the door. So the sponge tool can also saturate or bring out the color, give it some punch to help make the subject matter really pop out from the background. And finally, the burn tool. The burn tool can be used to pump up areas that are a little bit washed out. So the difference, look at the difference between the image. If we were correcting an image or restoring old photographs, this tool can be very helpful in bringing out areas that have gotten washed out over time. And you can probably see the difference between the washed out and the result of the burn tool. So let's take a look how this works. So I'll choose the burn tool, and I'll start with the midtones, and again, an exposure about halfway, 50%. The more I increase the exposure, the more I'm going to burn an area. As I decrease the exposure, I'm going to lessen the burn effect. I'm going to choose a little bit bigger brush to start with, and again, hardness right about there in the middle is a good place to start. I don't want to overdo it. Let's try a little bit larger brush so we can get a bit more area. And then we just begin going through using steady movement with the mouse or your tablet. And by burning the background and restoring this old photograph, again, I'm heightening the contrast between the subject, which is in the foreground and is very light, and the background, which could be a little bit darker as it has gotten washed out over time. And once again, contrast helps pull the viewer's eye towards the subject in a photograph. And the result is a little bit deeper and richer color and more contrast between subject and background. And this concludes your introduction to the following tools in your toolbar: the Dodge, Burn, and Sponge tool.